Alright, welcome back to another episode in our ongoing series where I talk to you about how to design better drinks. And today we're going to focus on specifically how to incorporate coffee into coffee cocktails. So when it comes to choosing coffee for a coffee cocktail, you've got lots of things to think about: where it comes from, how it's roasted, how you brew it, how much you add, and ultimately how it tastes in the final drink. And I see so many common mistakes that today we're going to talk about and how you can fix them at home. Make sure you stick around till the end of the video because I think the last tip is the most important and it might surprise you, given that it can both improve the quality of your drinks while saving you money at the same time. So let's get straight into the first point. So the first mistake that I see all the time is coffee being brewed too weak for mixing. So the thing to remember here is that the optimal recipe for drinking is not necessarily the same as the optimal recipe for mixing. So what I mean by this is that when you brew a cup of coffee, essentially all you have in the cup is coffee, water, and potentially some milk. So you don't have a lot of other ingredients to play up against. Whereas when you mix it into a drink, you've got really big ingredients in there, often a spirit, a sweetener, and lots of other kind of flavored ingredients. So you really want the coffee to punch through and be clearly identifiable in the drink. So when you're designing a recipe for a filter coffee, for example, most people will look at between 55 and 65 grams of coffee per litre of water. But when you're going to mix this into a cocktail, I'd be looking at 75 grams plus per litre as a starting point. This will give the coffee that you do add plenty of strength, meaning that you can really push that through in the final recipe. Similarly with espresso, you'd be looking at around about a ratio of 1:2 dose to yield when you're going to drink your coffee, maybe up to 1:3. But you can go as low as 1:1 when you're going to mix your espresso. And even though these kind of stronger cups are likely to be quite bright, quite vibrant, potentially sour, acidic, but loads of body, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because what you're going to do with your final drink is often add a sweetener in your spirit, like I say, which will balance out those bright acidic notes. So, as I said, optimal for drinking is going to be a really nice balanced drink to begin with, whereas optimal for mixing, it might be unbalanced, awaiting being balanced by the other ingredients. And I think that's a really powerful technique. You can use other techniques to really push your extraction to get it as high as possible within the strength limitations that you have. So you could have an extended bloom, you could grind finer, you could have a longer extraction time for an espresso. But ultimately what's important is that the final drink is balanced, not just the coffee element of the drink. So one example where I've used this approach recently is my Irish coffee recipe, which I'll put just above. And in this, we're looking at a minimum of 80 grams of coffee per litre of water for the coffee element of the drink. And you can get away with this because an Irish coffee has a sugar element and a spirit. And therefore, when we bring all these together, you get a balanced end result. And that's the most important thing. So you can watch that video in order to see how this is used. But now we're going to move on to our second point. So the second mistake I see all the time is that the coffee is either too dominant or not present enough in the drink. And you really need to be very intentional with this. So when you're thinking about designing a coffee cocktail, you need to think, do I want this to be a coffee forward drink, something like an espresso martini or an Irish coffee? Or do I want coffee to be a supporting flavor in the drink, where it brings complexity and that kind of underlying coffee note to elevate the drink to a new place? So even though you've brewed your coffee strong, just because you've got a strong base doesn't mean it's going to cut through the final drink. You need to add the right amount of the coffee in your final recipe. So this could be as little as a spritz of coffee on top of the drink to bring a subtle coffee aroma to an otherwise other ingredient led drink. Or you could have a double espresso, which is the beating heart of your drink, which is going to add loads of coffee character. So if you want to see two examples of this, which are at the complete opposite ends of the spectrum, you can watch my champagne coffee colada recipe, which I'll put above, which has a really subtle, delicate coffee note, which just brings those big flavors together. So you've got your tropical notes of your kind of pina colada inspired ingredients of pineapple and coconut. Then you've got your champagne and a coconut fat washed rum. So these are all big flavors, and then the coffee just bridges them all together using leftover coffee waste. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the espresso picante, which I'll put just here, which is essentially a big espresso forward drink with some flavor accents around it, in the style of an espresso martini, but kind of build in a really complex flavor profile. So those two videos will give you a really good understanding of how coffee can be incorporated into different drinks, from a very light supporting flavor to a very heavy dominant flavor. And if you're finding value in this, it'd mean a lot if you could subscribe to the channel by clicking on the button below. It's free, takes 2 seconds to do, but it massively supports the channel and it gives me the opportunity to make more videos where I can hopefully help you make more delicious drinks. So thank you for doing so if you can, and I appreciate you. And now, on to the third point. So the third mistake that I see all the time, which is really limiting for coffee and cocktails, is considering coffee as a singular flavor, rather than a massive spectrum of different flavors that coffee is capable of having. So, as many of you will know, no two coffees are going to be exactly the same. You'll find lots of different characteristics within all different coffees, determined by variables such as where it's grown, how it's processed, how it's roasted, how it's brewed, and many other variables in between. So there's a massive spectrum of flavors that coffee is capable of having. And if you look at the SCA flavor wheel, you'll see this, but there are many more flavors within coffee beyond that. So tasting is obviously really subjective. Don't beat yourself up if you don't taste exactly what's labeled on the bag. You can think about so many things here. Does it remind you of a food you've had in the past? Does it remind you of a drink you've had in the past? Does it remind you of a previous memory from either your childhood or more recently, that it brings back a kind of flavor recollection? There's so many things that coffee is capable of tasting of, and to consider that as one singular flavor is a massive limiting mistake. Even if you have a few different coffees, you could even just smell the aroma of them and you'll notice drastic differences between them. So in terms of the spectrum of flavor, you've got very bright, clean, acidic coffees, you've got kind of very sweet, rich, intense coffees, and then you've got very kind of dark, bitter, intense coffees. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You've got all sorts of different flavors that can be found in coffee. We can find tropical fruit notes, we can find tea-like notes, lots of different berry-like notes. The list is endless, so just be mindful that coffee can add so much to a drink rather than just coffee flavor. So if you want to see a few examples of this, even within the framework of an espresso martini, you can use a kind of chocolatey, nutty espresso for a very classic espresso martini, but you can take this a few different ways. So one example would be the tropical espresso martini, which I'll put just above, which has those kind of tropical fruit notes tied in with some rum, some coconut, and those really nice kind of exotic flavors. Or you could watch my video about the breakfast espresso martini, which I don't think has been done before, which I'll put just here, which has loads of kind of orange citrus fruit flavors in the coffee, acting as one of the forms of acidity in the final drink. So even in those three examples, we've got quite a similar template, but drastically different end results. So the power of coffee is huge, and make sure you tie it with the other ingredients in the drink to get a delicious end result. And that leads me on nicely to our next point, which is adding the same flavors you find in the coffee into the final drink. So this next point isn't necessarily a mistake, but you just need to be mindful that this isn't the only way to do things. So if you take a bag of coffee and you look at the flavor notes on the bag and you find A, B, and C, and then you build on flavors A, B, and C to create a coffee cocktail, that's actually a really powerful approach. And I actually did this recently in this video, where I took two different coffees and built completely different coffee cocktails around the flavor notes of the drink. But this isn't the only way to do things. That kind of complementary approach is really powerful, but you can also contrast what's already in there. So I'll be covering this in future videos where you take those flavor notes and build contrasting flavors to get a harmonious end result. But the most important thing to remember here is that you're not just adding what's already there. Sometimes you need to fill in the gaps of what's not there to create a final drink. And now we move on to our final point, which might surprise a lot of you, but it's a really, really important one. And that's that more expensive coffees don't necessarily make better cocktails. So going back to what I said in point one, the optimal coffee for drinking isn't necessarily the optimal coffee for mixing into a cocktail. And this is a really important thing to remember. A lot of these expensive coffees are really prized because they're subtle, they're nuanced, they're complex, they're delicate, and they're clean. But in a cocktail, that's actually completely lost. And you actually don't get the value from the coffee that you would otherwise just drinking on its own. If you're adding big ingredients like spirits and sweeteners to this, potentially shaking it up or stirring it down over ice, all those amazing characteristics that make that coffee special become way less important and actually gets lost in the final drink, which we don't want. So what you do want to do is pick a coffee that perfectly suits the final drink you're making. And more expensive coffees don't necessarily do that. Just look for either the flavor notes on the bag, the origin, the process that you're looking for that's going to fulfill your final drink. And that's way more important than spending more money, potentially for either diminishing returns or to negatively impact the drink. So if we take one of the most popular cocktails in the world as an example, the espresso martini, generally in the coffee you're looking for high sweetness, high body, high intensity, and that's what most of your kind of house blends are really striving for from most specialty roasters. You don't need to buy super expensive coffee to tick that criteria. So I'm not saying don't buy expensive coffee. What I'm saying here is choose the right coffee for the drink you're making, and that's again the most important thing. So they're the 5 most common mistakes that I see when people incorporate coffee into cocktails, but now I want to hear from you. Do you have any tips? Are there any common mistakes that I've missed? And how do you incorporate coffee into your own cocktails? Thanks for watching. Cheers.